Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California, where right now the coronavirus is raging out of control, much like New York back in the spring. And so we have barely left our apartment except to walk the dog, and my brain in the last 3 weeks, I made it 8 months without cognitive decline, and in the last 3 weeks, my brain has turned completely to oatmeal. I described it to my friend the other day as it's like waking up groggy and just existing in that state forever. You might have felt or be feeling the same thing. It's the constant monotony of place that grinds your neurons down to nubs. It is like thinking through cotton. It is like your thoughts are trapped under an avalanche and they are struggling to get out. Is this what being high is like? Yes, I have never smoked pot before in my life, so this is what it's like. Anyway, great episode today. I'm glad I recorded this one well before my brain atrophied. This was done right at the end of August, beginning of September, and of course my guest today is comics writer Cy Spurrier, comics writer Simon Spurrier. And if you don't know who Cy is, let me read you his bio right now. Raised just outside London, Simon Spurrier had a number of different jobs before he began writing for comics. He started with the British small press, after which he created a number of series for the beloved UK cult comic 2000 AD. This success led to work in the American mainstream, which includes runs on Hellblazer, X-Men Legacy, X-Force, The Dreaming, and the GLAAD award-winning Star Wars Dr. Aphra. It also led to the opportunity to write a great deal of creator-owned work here, such as The Spire, Coda, Alienated, and Six Gun Gorilla, and much more, all of which are well worth your time. Recently, it was announced that Cy would be writing a new book as part of Jonathan Hickman's revamped X-Men line. So I am just an unabashed fan of Cy's work. I remember reading X-Men Legacy and just being entranced, I think is a good word. I started reading comics in the 1990s when it was, let's just say, extreme. And so the fact that in the, let's say, early 2000s, there were a lot of really cool writers that were writing a lot more nuanced work in superhero genres. I'm an X-Men fan, and so Grant Morrison and Cy Spurrier, and I think Mike Carey is British, but whether or not he is writing interesting, cool stuff. And since reading his run on X-Men Legacy, anything Cy writes, I very quickly devour, and it never disappoints. So it was lovely to talk to him and find out that there is a very cool, nice, interesting person behind his work. So I hope you like this episode. If you do, and you want to check out other episodes of Beginnings, most podcast apps should have the last 100 episodes. Spotify has them all, going back 11 years, and the MP3s are all there for free at beginnings.libsyn.com. Now, what I like to do is suggest some episodes to you, the listener, if this is your first time. Now, Cy's a comic book writer. What about other comic book writers that I've had on the show, both from the world of indie comics and to mainstream? Rob Guillory, Michael Kupperman, Chris Claremont, Cecil Castellucci, Jackson Public, Sina Grace, Paul Hornschmeyer, Charles Sewell, Gabrielle Bell, Lisa Hannawalt, who also works on BoJack Horseman, Zippy the Pinhead creator Bill Griffith, and tons of other people from the world of TV and art and music. So if you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, Amazon, tons of other places. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. And stay tuned. I got some great episodes coming up. Again, if you like comics, I just talked to Chip Zdarsky. He's a great dude. It was a great talk. Ian Mackay coming up. Tobin Sprout from Guided by Voices. Bob Nastanovich from Pavement. Mary Timony. I just had 2 great talks. Mary Timony and also Francis Quinlan from Hop Along. So look out for that stuff. Joe Jack Talcum from the Dead Milkman. All right, stay tuned for those. Stay safe, especially if you live in Los Angeles. And now, let's talk to Cy. I try not to ask about people's actual things that they made because I don't know. You're probably bored of talking about these things at this point. I have 2 questions though that I thought of. One is very basic. Are you a Steve Eilert fan at all?
Not only because I don't know the name.
He's a British writer. I think he gets lumped in with cyberpunk, even though I don't think he really.
Steve Eilert.
Yeah, Aylett. I don't think he deserves to be called cyberpunk, even though I guess some of the stuff he was writing can get thrown into that genre. But some of your writing reminds me of him a little bit.
Cool.
He's very funny and he's great. I don't know. I just wanted to ask that just because I get curious. Okay, here's the second question. In any way, is Coda about being in a relationship with someone who has depression or something around that?
I mean, there's a bit of that in there. That's, one of my foundation myths was not a million miles away from that. Like 10 years ago, I went through some horrible stuff with somebody who really did need help and I didn't know how to give it. And there's an awful lot of, I mean, look, we all know that you can't write good genre fiction without some sort of fundamentally honest humanity in it, and there's therefore an awful lot of experiential memory in these things.
You would be surprised, by the way, of the genre fiction I've read that does not ground it in any kind of actual human emotion or experience.
Yeah.
Okay, those are the 2 basic questions I had. I think, look, without getting I don't like to fawn too much when I talk to people.
You're very welcome to fawn. It's okay. I'm a writer. Like I don't get any other validation other than fawning. So carry on, fawn.
But
fawn down.
But yeah, your work speaks to me in a very deep way, and I'm kind of curious. I tried to find some biographical information on you online, and there wasn't much besides like your work history. And I'm kind of curious, like where did you grow up? What was your household like when you were growing up?
Sure. It's funny you sort of you don't get to ask people to write your own Wikipedia entry. You probably should. I'm sure lots of people do. Like, here's my potted biography. Could you please put this up for me? But it's one is entirely in the hands of people who ask the right questions. And I've never been, and I'm taking a slightly circuitous route to answering the question, but I've never been the sort of writer who stands in front of my work. I like to stand behind my work, and most of the people with whom I'm really tight in the funny little sphere of comics are those people. And I'm very close to some of the exact opposite. Like Kieran Gillen's a very good friend, and he's absolutely the sort of writer who stands in front of his work rather than behind his work. But so it's never really bothered me that my history is not really part of the brand, because I'd far rather the work is part of the brand, and I kind of cringe inwardly when I hear myself using the word brand anyway, and here I am saying brand 4 times in the same sentence. But I had an utterly ordinary upbringing, and I was raised in a county outside London called Berkshire, which is about as close as you can get to Hobbiton. It's a sort of leafy green idyll with small churchy towns and relatively posh schools, and that's why I sound like I'm literally reading the news on the BBC at 6 p.m. every day whenever I chat to people. It's pathetic, actually. I've recently moved to a little town called Margate, which is a very trendy little hipster place right down on the coast. We've got the beach down at the end of our road. It's the sort of town where there's a real muddle of classes and creeds and races, and it's very cool and very kind of vibrant, but it obviously has problems, as all places where there's friction between different types of humans will always be. But I find myself moderating my accent whenever I walk past certain people on the street. Like, I'll start dropping my T's and trying to sound a little bit more common, because I don't want people to think I'm from Berkshire. And it's pathetic. It's really cowardly, because this is Britain and you will get judged based on your accent. But yeah, my folks are happily married. I have a splendid sister. Went to a succession of pretty decent schools, did well, got mildly bullied, then probably did some mild bullying, and yeah, it's a totally ordinary picture. It's so disgustingly well adjusted that I really have nothing to report.
Is that why you're kind of like, oh, I'll just let that be in the background?
Maybe. I mean, and do you know what? This is another very quintessentially British thing. I sort of struggle to dig from what seems ordinary to me things which would probably seem unusual or extraordinary if presented to other people. Do you know what I mean? We all sort of normalize our experience. You know, I make a joke about being bullied at school, but I was quite badly bullied at school, and it did screw me up. I had ME for a year and didn't go to school for 8 months and just sat on a sofa slowly putting on weight and feeling sorry for myself, and then went back to school and was even worse bullied as a result. I don't know if this is the same in the US school system, but there's this funny culture here where up until the age of 16 or 17, which I don't know if this is still the case, but certainly when I was at school, that was when kids who didn't intend to carry on to higher education would choose to leave. They wouldn't need to carry on into what we call sixth form, which I guess is like college for you guys. Up to that point, it was desperately uncool to be in any way academically good, to be halfway decent at any of the academia, to be the sort of kid who is curious and wants to ask questions. And in fact, I have this searing memory one day in a physics class of asking the teacher questions because I was really interested in what she was teaching. And she threw me out of the class because she didn't understand what she literally said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, "You're not as clever as Einstein and you're not as clever as me, so stop asking questions and get out." And I had to stand in the hall outside, and she was clearly just having a really bad day because there were a bunch of assholes in our class who were making her life miserable. But that kind of set the tone, in as much as if you're interested, and if as a result of being interested you actually take this seriously and probably achieve relatively well, you're not cool. And the cool kids were the ones who didn't give a shit and were really good at football and rugby and the sort of the sporty stuff. And they all fucked off at the age of 17. I'm swearing dreadfully. I apologize. I assume that that's okay. They all disappeared. And suddenly you're left with some of those kids, the kids who had previously been bullies, but were academically gifted enough to continue with their studies, having to look around themselves and realize that all of their cronies and henchmen were gone. And the culture was utterly different. And so there were these 2 beautiful years for me when suddenly I was mixing with kids who I previously had hated. This is like age 17, 18, before people all disappear to pursue careers or go to university or whatever. And so when I look back on my school life, there's that whole cliche about it's the happiest years of your life. I mean, it really wasn't. It was desperate. But those 2 years when I was 17, 18 were literally the happiest years of my life, because it was suddenly okay to be honest with the achievements that you sought and the acclaim that you were constantly hoping to achieve by being good at things. And I don't just mean like maths and physics and that stuff. You know, my A levels, which is the sort of the final year exam we do here, which I guess is sort of, I don't know what the parallel would be in the US. It's sort of college majors or something like that. I don't know, but I did English literature, and I did art, and I did media studies, which one of those subjects that it's like a joke subject if you don't care, but if you do care, it's actually extremely enlightening. I learned a lot. I had one of those, again, dealing in cliches. Everybody's got the teacher or the professor who changes their life, and that was mine. His name was Mr. Wilson, and he was sarcastic and horrible and extremely witty and intelligent, and I loved him, and he got on really well with me. And yeah, I think he sort of changed my life a little bit. He taught photography as well, so we just sort of bounced off each other and the other kids in my class, and yeah, it was really creative time. And I discovered, this is like one of those beautiful segues, I discovered comics during those 2 years. I was in an art room one day doing some painting, and I pulled open a drawer looking for something, and some kid who'd left the school the year before had left a massive stash of 2000 ADs in this big drawer. They'd probably been tearing them out to use as collage or something. The first thing that meets my eye is a Simon Bisley painting of Judge Dredd punching somebody right through the face, gore exploding out the back. Oh my God, this is not comics that I thought existed. This is something completely different. And yeah, I think within 2 weeks I was subscribing to 2000 AD and reading everything I could get my hands onto, and of course drawing, because it hadn't really occurred to me yet that writing comics was a thing that any human being actually did. It was just something that happened. You know, you need to be an artist, obviously, but words, they just happen. And to cut forward slightly, when I started taking seriously the notion, many years later, the notion of a career in comics, there was a short period where I kind of felt like it was either going to be as an artist or as a writer, and it couldn't be both, because I didn't have the talent to do both in parallel. I needed to focus and to practice endlessly. And I had a very brutal conversation with myself where I acknowledged that I could practice all day, every day for the rest of my life, and maybe one day be an okay artist, or I could practice all day, every day for the rest of my life, and hopefully one day be a writer that I feel proud of, you know. So that's where we are.
That I know that exact thing. I had this choice where, like, I'm a fine performer. Mm-hmm. I'm fine. And I think if I really dedicated myself to it, I could stay fine as a performer. But I'm I would say very good to like great writer. And it's because there was this point where I was at UCB at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I'll ever get beyond like fine. And I should really, if writing is what I'm really good at, maybe I should just dedicate myself to actually being very good at that. Instead of like I would split my focus between like 10 different things.
Yeah. And you can't. There's only so much mental energy to go around.
Yeah. I have like 10 questions or so, but from what you were just saying, but like, here's something that I don't think in America, I get it, or like a lot of us get. What is it about 2000 AD that produces like the best writers in comics?
That's a really good question. I think if I knew the perfect answer to that, then we'd be able to bottle it and make a million. It's just a really strange cultural niche that it occupies. And it's not like any other publication, certainly not one in the States. It typifies a whole bunch of different things that aren't really supposed to work and often don't work, certainly not in the US market, which is overtly political stories, often really dumb sci-fi. Like there's no often, I mean, I'm generalizing. Some of it is extremely clever and intelligent, but the sort of the base point for 2000 is angry sci-fi. It's punky, it's angry, it's shouting about things that are wrong. There's very little subtext in a lot of those stories. But most importantly, it's delivered in very small chunks. It comes out every week. In any given issue, there are probably 6 chapters of ongoing stories running in parallel, which probably don't occupy the same shared worlds. They're all completely separate, discrete stories, told in chunks of maybe 4, 5, or 6 pages. So the writers and artists have to very quickly do away with all the things which, when we eventually start working in what is PS erroneously referred to as the American mainstream version of comics, such as splash pages and 2 or 3 panels on every page, all these things which are slightly snobbishly referred to as decompression, but in my mind are actually just laziness. That's unfair. You can use them very well, but most people don't. But in 2000 AD, you don't have that crutch to lean on. You have to pack your plot and your characterization and your twists and your comedy and your mood and all the other things into these tiny little nuggets. And this isn't like old school comics where there's like 20 panels on a page. This is 5 or 6 panels on a page. So economy of narrative is utterly critical. And I think what's going on is that when writers in particular, but also artists, are raised in that school of thought, then when they later make the leap to a slightly more, I was about to say flabby, but that's desperately unfair, a slightly more decompressed version of storytelling, such as you would get in your classic kind of 22-page US monthly, the temptation is to just go, well, I'll tell the same amount of story in and that's not actually what happens. What you find is that most of the British creators who are moving across to use the US format will simply fill up that space with the same density of story, or at least the same intensity of emotion that they would have been using had they been doing a 2000 AD story. And I'm sort of reaching here, but maybe what happens is they realize, well, one of the things I can start introducing is a little bit of subtext and a little bit of nuance. And so you get these guys who are very, and I keep using the word guys, and it's unfair, but let's be honest, it was all guys at the beginning, and I can't deny that. I'm hoping that that's changing now. I mean, I'm still quite tight with a lot of the guys at 2000 AD, and there are indeed some extremely talented non-white cis creators moving into that. Non-white cis male creators moving into that field. I've just lost my train of thought. When they make the leap across the pond to the US format, I guess it's like, yeah, just being able to let your belt out a little bit and find new ways to express the same emotions that can be a little bit more nuanced and subtle. So I don't know if that explains exactly why you've got your Alan Moores and your John Wagners and your Grant Morrisons and your Alan Moores and all these guys just suddenly exploding onto the American scene. I think there's probably something to be said for the kind of pluripotency of cynicism. I think cynicism travels very well towards naivety in a way that the opposite is not true. Yeah, that's my guess. It ain't a good guess, but it's all I've got.
Let me throw this at you, see if this resonates at all. I wonder if also you have the constraint. You have to learn how to write well under a certain kind of constraint. And then when you come over to America, and you not only have, or you have more space, but you have now corporate constraints on you. And so knowing how to write under certain kinds of constraints allows you to like, oh, well, I can still write well, even knowing that there are these editors and I'm not allowed to say this thing. I'm not allowed to do this. But it's like, have you ever read any of the people who write with Oulipo, that French? It's a French. I don't know if there's still a lot of their members have died. There was mostly a group in the like 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they wrote. A lot of them were like mathematicians and authors, and they wrote using like George Perec is one of the famous ones. He wrote a famous book called La Disparition, which it doesn't use the letter E, and the whole idea was. It doesn't use the letter E, but it has to make sense, and the constraint has to actually, in some way, inform the plot. It can't just be incidental.
Yeah. So it's not like what's the school of cinema, the manifesto guys? What were they?
Dogma 95.
Yeah, all those guys. It's like the sort of arbitrary application of constraints to engender art and creativity. Yeah, I buy that.
Yeah,
it's quite funny. I mean, what you say about the sort of suddenly finding yourself constrained in different ways, corporately and editorially. There is something quite lovely about, especially with my plummy goddamn accent. If I'm on a phone call with a US editor, they expect me to be a puppy dog. They expect me to be Hugh Grant. You know, oh, I'm very sorry, please don't. And if I'm able to turn around and say, no, I'm right and you're wrong, it's like they're being savaged by a kitten and they don't really know how to deal with it. And you get your way quite frequently by just sort of pivoting. So yeah, I think you're onto something. I think it is remarkable, is it not, how many of what we still call the British invasion, those sort of first talented British men, mostly, in fact, entirely men who came over and got noticed, did their best work when it was under the constraints of license, or under the constraints of somebody else's shared universe, or under the constraints of a character that they didn't create, or whatever it may be. There are definitely exceptions, but it's almost as if when given the opportunity to just go nuts, here you go, blank sheet, away you go, they would sort of overreach or create something that didn't quite have the same impact, or maybe just didn't have its feet firmly enough planted on the ground that everybody could figure out what they were up to. But when you get your Watchmen's and your Killing Jokes and your Arkham Asylums and all that sort of stuff, these are people having to create their asses off because they're being trodden on, and it's that, isn't it? It's critical mass. It's the sort of I don't know a better way to put it than that. It's the crisis that occurs when you feel that you have to create, otherwise you're going to be squashed.
I mean, I don't like to have hard and fast rules about creating, or like hard and fast theories, like you have to do this to create well. But I do think that in some in a lot of things, like let's just say that there's a lot of things that I like that I think the core of them is some kind of tension, and I think whether my taste is good taste or not. So, take it with a grain of salt when I say the things that I like, as if that is the highest point of culture. But the things that I like, I think often, whether it's music, I think like a lot of the bands I like, I think the members hated each other at some point, and the best music came from the point before they all like hated each other so much they couldn't work together, but we're still working together. And I think that tension, or the tension between if they all came from like different genre backgrounds and those genres. And I think in some way also like, I live here in Los Angeles and I write TV, and I think sometimes, not all the time, but like when there is a fair amount of tension between what you want and what the people who are paying you want, and it's equitable in some way and not just overpowering from the corporate side, that can often lead to good things.
Sure, I totally buy that. And what's really strange is having done a little bit of all sorts of writing, I've done novels, I've done TV, I've done comics, I've done games. The direction in which I increasingly am drawn as I get older is towards collaborative writing, sitting in a room with trusted friends who are also writers, who, if you're lucky, will still be your friends at the end of the day, even though you've had X number of discussions, in inverted commas, usually with voices raised. And you're right, that level of safe dysfunction, controlled crisis, is what will, more times than not, create the really good stuff.
So I want to go back a little bit to your childhood, just because there were a couple things in there that really interested me. What was the class composition of where you grew up?
As in social class, as
Yeah.
opposed to school class. Probably like B1. If that, I don't know if you have do you have the letters where you are? Does that make any sense to you? No, it's okay. So
No one in America pays any attention to class. Class
right.
does not exist here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's alive and well where I grew up, and frankly everywhere here. But it's, I guess, here's what's strange, and this is more true now than then. But for the sake of argument, it was slightly true then. You can grow up in somewhere that's like upper middle class, lower upper class, somewhere very well to do, as I did, and still have no luxuries in your life, still not have two pennies to rub together. You can be living next door to somebody poorly educated with a terrible attitude who owns 8 cars and a house that's 3 times bigger than yours because they got lucky. They happened to be a plumber at the right time when there were no whatever it is. And there have been all sorts of funny little booms like that, and in the UK over the years. Where I grew up, I cannot deny, is about as white as it's possible to get. About as sort of leafy rural idyll as it's possible to imagine. It's a commuter belt, so lots of the people who lived there would be traveling in and out of London every day, so lots of money coming out of London. But the school that I went to from when I was like 11, it's this remarkable place. It's called Licensed Victualler's School. And a licensed victualler is somebody who is licensed by the government to sell alcohol. So it's a charity set up a century before for the children of publicans, people who owned pubs or off licenses, people who sold booze. And 100 years later, it was still running as a school, much more modern affair, which allowed other kids in. So it's not like my parents were publicans, but a lot of the kids who were there on scholarships or simply flat out paid for because they were children of publicans were coming down from really deprived parts of London, like the East End of London or further north. So it was what I would regard an extremely healthy mix of people of all shapes and sizes, and most importantly, of all class backgrounds, because you had people like me who sound like I'm reading the Queen's fucking speech, and then you've got my mates who live in Leytonstone, who I still hang out with, and who talk like they're extras off EastEnders, and are far more real than I ever would be. And we all muddled together and got along. And those are, strangely enough, the people with whom I've had the most lasting friendships. And I don't really see or speak to anybody from my hometown anymore, which is odd. But yeah, that's again, this is all a little needlessly granular, but we have over here so many different forms of school. There's public schools and state schools and private schools, and abstractly, this place that I went to was a private school, and that means a fee-paying school. So my parents wouldn't have been able to send me and my sister there if they weren't paying for it. And generally, that goes hand in hand with assumptions about class. If you're going to a private school, it's probably because you wear a jaunty little uniform, and you're probably going to go to Oxford or Cambridge, and you're definitely privileged. And none of those things were true about the place I went. We were only able to go there because my grandmother died and left some money, and then I couldn't afford to stay there into the last 3 years unless I got a scholarship, which I did, which saved our bacon. Um, so yeah, it was just a really weird crucible of influences and classes, and that's probably really healthy. Like, I know guys that I was very young with who went off to all boys schools and boarding schools and stuff, and they're ideologically quite distinct from me, let's put it that way. Proper hooray Henrys, let's go kill some foxes, that stuff. These cliches exist for a reason, because the kind of public schoolboy networks are alive and well here. All the members of our current cabinet were all hoorahs together in university and school. These things don't go away.
I just imagine an entire group of like Tony Blairs.
Yeah, I mean, it's worse. It's Boris Johnson's and yeah, the Bullingdon clubs, all those guys. But yeah, it's a weird setup. And I mean, look, I've got a 2-year-old kid now, and we've moved, as I said before, to this funny little corner of the country, which is every bit as vibrant and slightly edgy, in the sense that there are clear frictions between the different sort of societal factions that live nearby. And I don't really know what to make of school. I need to start thinking about which school we're going to send him to, and then you start realizing there's probably no choice in the matter. It's probably whichever one is closest and free. So lots of bridges to be crossed there.
The other thing that I was really curious about was the fact that you were talking about that there's this, I don't know if this is the phrase you use, but like, say, a non-academic culture, or a culture that kind of mocked up until you were about 17, that kind of mocked anyone who was curious. I thought it was even reinforced by the teacher. I mean, I know it was just like you said, that the teacher was probably just having a bad day, but the fact that I would guess that it was reinforced in other ways by other teachers.
Sometimes, I mean, that's the weird thing about private schools, is the teachers are chosen because they're good at interviews, like going for any job. It may not be that they get the best results. It's that they're the best able to persuade the person in charge to hire them.
It's like auditioning.
Say again?
It's like auditioning. Like when there are people here that are really good at auditioning but aren't great actors.
Well, that's true in every single school of life where you need to go for an interview, and teaching is catastrophic if you choose the wrong person. And I mean, I'm delighted to be able to say that the vast majority of my teachers were excellent, and as I said before, some of them left a really serious, lasting impression on me. I don't know what was behind that woman's little outburst. It certainly wasn't the only example of something like that. I think that there's just I don't know, it probably speaks to class again. Everything here does, honestly, come back to class sooner or later. There's, tell you the best way to explain this. You heard of a TV show called Only Fools and Horses? Right, so for the benefit of those who don't, it's two East London-based losers, I guess. They're market stall holders. They're like petty criminals sometimes. Their whole idea is that they find goods that have fallen off the back of a truck, and then they sell it for a stupid profit at their silly little market stall. And they're constantly hustling. They're constantly looking for the next big break, trying to work their way up the pole. And the refrain is always, "This time next year, Rodney, we're going to be millionaires." Now, in British culture, if they ever succeed, that's the end of the story. Because you cannot have a protagonist, a cultural hero, anything like a relatable icon of a character if they have succeeded. Now, in the States, it's okay. The stakes are permitted to tell a story about somebody who has led a successful life, and the stakes of their story are that they might have it all taken away from them. That's a story we've seen many, many times. A successful man, often an older guy, flirting with alcoholism, or he's had a mental breakdown, or whatever it is, or he's been caught sleeping with his wife's sister, whatever it is. The stakes are he had it all, now he might lose it. In the UK, if somebody starts with it all, we don't want to know. That is not a story that interests us. In fact, I would go so far as to say that success disgusts us on a cultural level. We don't like it. We all want it. We're all abstractly working towards it, but don't put it in our face, because that's not interesting. I want to hear stories about struggle and plucky, good-natured, common people who are constantly fighting the good fight, but never quite making it, but they're undaunted and they get right back up and they keep on hustling. Well, that, I suspect, is what is behind what I was talking about earlier. This notion that up to a certain age anyway, anybody who quite unashamedly sets their eyes on some sort of intellectual or academic achievement is disgusting. They're certainly not very cool, because they're not fun to be around. They're not plucky, they're not silly, they're not fun. And then inevitably the moment comes at the age somewhere between 16 and 18 where the people who have been disgusted by this notion realize that actually what their future holds is apprenticeship and craft. And I hope for their sake, all those guys and girls, because it wasn't just the blokes in this one case, found amazing niches in their lives. But it wasn't because they applied themselves particularly hard at school. And it certainly wasn't because they were curious. They would not pick up a book to read. Like I used to sit on my lunch breaks. If I wasn't hanging out with anybody, I'd read a book. I was a voracious reader. And I got laughed at countless times for just sitting around reading a book. Why are you reading a book? That'd be stupid. Go and throw a frisbee around or something. Well, I could do that too, but this is a good book. Can I please finish my book? And after a certain point, it was okay to read a book, because the only other people around you in that school scenario were also people who like to read books. And I'm reducing, and it's a little unfair to be so generalizing, but yeah, there's something culturally awkward about the notion of unashamed achievement, which I think persists. I don't know. I mean, I'll be interesting to find out when my kid does get to school whether that's still a thing.
Well, what's the thing that I mean, was it just the quirk of your personality that allowed you to kind of push through this? You know, what made you want to become a writer then? You know, how did you get on the track of doing this as a career if achievement is something not to aspire towards?
I think it never felt that way to me. It may have felt like that to some of the people around me, but if anything, I mean, this is a soft answer, but if you're the sort of kid who grew up being teased for reading your book, you just end up reading your book in smaller and darker rooms, and eventually one day you're like, maybe I could write this book instead of, that's the sort of the lazy through line. In practice, it was a little more complex than that. I was the kid who always wanted to write. Like if we were given an assignment for our English literature class, and it was either write an essay on the use of sibilants in Pride and Prejudice, or write a short piece of speculative fiction about what it was like being a fucking horse pulling a carrot. I don't know, I'm making it up, but I would always choose the dumb creative writing thing, because that just was far more interesting to me. And all the analytical side, it always felt arbitrary. It always felt like, here we are, we're sitting around, we're picking apart the words of a dead author or authoress, and we're counting the number of vowels that he or she used, and we're trying to find some sort of linguistic code and take it apart and see how it works and see what effect it has on the reader. When for me, it was always just instinctive. Like these writers, they're not sitting there thinking these thoughts. At the very most, they're reading their words aloud and thinking that feels right. And I mean, apropos of nothing else, when I'm sitting writing now, I will always read aloud what I've written, and because it can tell if it feels right. If something has meter and cadence and the right use of consonant, then it works. I don't need to sit there and think about why. I don't need to analyze it and write notes in the margin. It just works. But yeah, I bounced out of school intending to pursue an artist's career. I did a foundation year in art college. Foundation year is the sort of it's like a sort of hippies gap year, I guess, except that you're kind of learning as many different artistic techniques as you can. So I did a bit of illustration, painting, drawing, photography, film and video, all sorts of other things I've forgotten. And I genuinely expected that I was going to go and do an illustration degree somewhere because that was my world. But I kind of got hoodwinked by film and TV, and I'd always been doing bits of creative writing in the background semi-seriously. And then I started getting more serious about film, realized that this was a way I could kind of combine various of the things I was always interested in, photography and script work. And that seemed to be my direction for a little while. I actually spent a year as an art director for the BBC doing a whole bunch of like TV stuff. I got very early into a very useful mentorship relationship with this incredible lady. She's a BAFTA winning production designer called Eileen Diss, who I still don't know why she put any faith in me. I was this snotty little 21-year-old at this point, and she was putting me in charge of these big crews of 50-year-old props guys who really don't like being told what to do by anybody, let alone a pale 21-year-old who doesn't know what he's talking about. But yeah, that was an enlightening year. At the end of the year, I had decided that this just wasn't for me. Everything that was happening on set felt like craft. And to go back to the constraints we were talking about before, everything I did felt like it was constantly bumping against constraints. This wasn't truly creative. I was dressing sets and making everything look beautiful in front of the camera, but it was all, everything was all in service ultimately to the script. Even the director, who seemed to be this sort of godlike figure who's snapping his fingers, and if you're an actor, I imagine the director really is God, because he's controlling your emotional tempo and your meter. But for me, he was just another slave to the script. And evidently deep down, there was a ghastly, ambitious little monster inside me who was like, well, if the script has all these slaves, then hey, maybe I should be the one writing the script. And that happened to coincide with me getting my first published work with 2000 AD, and then doing some prose work and getting some licensed novels off the ground. And it all just kind of clattered into place all at once. Like there was a couple of years when I could have been a comics writer or a TV writer or a novelist, and I kind of did a little bit of all of them. And it just so happened that comics is the one that ended up paying my bills and taking most of my time. And the others have always stayed with me as the things that kind of happen when I've got time.
It's almost evolutionary in the sense that, like, you know, like the way natural selection works, there's just some kind of, I don't know, some flap on an animal, and the environment changes, and suddenly that flap is really important.
Yeah.
And it's that same kind of, I think, like when I talk to a lot of people on the show, it feels like a lot, you know, unless their parent was an actor or unless they're dynastic in some way in whatever creative area they do, it really is that kind of evolutionary thing where it's like, well, I could have done a bunch of things. Like I was a philosophy professor for a while, and I would have had a fine life. I don't think I would have been like super happy, but I would have, you know, it would have been fine if I had like stayed doing that. But it just, you know, the environment changed enough that I ended up doing this.
I mean, we're extremely good at creating for ourselves these etiological straight lines that mythologize our story, so that no matter how many kinks and turns and twists, and no matter how often we get kicked off our path and have to find a new path, we will, with the benefit of hindsight, convince ourselves that this was a direct straight line between start and end, and it's for the best, by the way, and this was the best possible outcome. And that's, every breakup we've ever had, 3 years later you're like, oh, I'm so glad that it ended. But no, you were ruined. But the brain is telling you my life is better now, and that's how we get by. That's how we exist as humans.
Well, that's my theory, again, take this with a grain of salt, is that we're in this kind of like paradigm shift right now as a global culture between linear thinking and dialectical thinking, and that if we don't actually start thinking about things in a dialectical or systemic way, that it's not I am not too I don't have like a cheery picture of the future at the moment, but maybe that's just being here in America.
Yeah, no, I think you're on the money. I have a pub theory that comes out whenever I'm too many glasses of cheap red wine into an evening, to do with religion specifically, but I think it has some credence here. It's the notion that religion is a technology which came about to allow human societies to transition from small family tribal groups onwards to non-familial, usually city-based structures. And like all good technology, it has its own superfluousness built into it. At some point, you no longer need this benign diktat coming from on high to tell you what you must do in order to lead a good life, because you're now enlightened enough to understand that there are perfectly sensible reasons for you to do these things, not to kill each other, not to sleep with your own sister, not to steal from your neighbor in case he then comes and steals from you. These are all things that we can now rationalize and understand. The question is, what's the next technology to save us from the fact that we're now running into all these other problems? And some of those problems are caused by pockets. Theism and faith, like all superstition, is not something that just evaporates. It actually becomes more concentrated the less of it there is. And that's why you are starting to see fanaticism, extremism of not just religion, but philosophy. But yeah, I think you're right. I think the psychic shift from centralized linear thinking as a result of being born and bred with the notion that there is this single unifying moral code into something that is far more capable of adaptation and flexibility is probably the next thing. And if we can't figure out how that works, we're fucked.
Yeah. I mean, fingers crossed. But like, it is like in some way, there are very positive things. I don't have any faith. I don't have any, I mean, religious faith. Whatever is in other people that have it, it's not in me. But like I find that there are good things in the people that do have it that I see that are not monsters. There's something positive about religion for them. But in culturally or societally, like the religion has kind of been exhausted at this point. And we're just in this postmodern era where there's no positive thing. Like this one thing has been exhausted. This one way that kind of oversaw, or like you said, this technology that organized society for, a millennia or so is completely exhausted. There's nothing, and we're in this transition period, and I'm really anxious if we will survive this transition period to whatever the next organizing, whether it is.
Like I have always railed against the organized part of religion. I too have no faith, but I've always characterized myself as a sort of disappointed cynic. I would really, really love it if some of this stuff were true, whether it's ghosts and goblins or big sky daddies or floating multi-armed triads, whatever. I would love it if some of that were true, because it would It would reveal a whole secondary skein of existence, which would, apart from anything else, mean that all the stupid stuff we write about is not as stupid as we first thought it was. But I think that's unlikely to happen. But oddly enough, the stuff that I think has the most measurable benefit to societies in terms of making societies function on the whole better than they would do without it are some of the really tedious trappings of organized religion. And by that, I'm talking about getting a bunch of people into the same room and singing at the same time, getting a bunch of people together to talk about their ideas, or to, for just an hour once a week, totally reduce their inhibitions to zero and share something with each other. And it doesn't have to be spiritual. It's great if it is, but it's as simple as putting away your barrier, putting away your shield, and being part of something that is purely speculative. And that, I think, is utterly vital. I think it's beautiful in the truest sense of the word. It's art. But we are all a little bit psychically constipated and emotionally especially those of us who are, look at us, we're such clever cynics and we don't believe in God, and ha ha ha, we better go and have another coffee. And I'm that person. We're not very good at sharing in a sort of totally unpretentious, earnest way. And I think that's what we're missing out on. And I mean, I would even be prepared to start putting on silly frocks and outfits and burning incense and doing all the ceremonial stuff, because ceremony is just window dressing. It's just it's like if religion is a beautiful melody, then ceremony is the metronome going tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. And we can change the melody. It doesn't have to be on a piano even, but the tick tock is actually quite important.
Yeah, I'm Jewish, and for me, the important part of Judaism is the moral project of Judaism, and it's backed up by the ritual. So, because even though I don't have faith and I don't really, I don't know, I don't like going to temple. It's boring, but I find some kind of meaning in fasting on Yom Kippur, because that backs up a moral project of atoning for the shitty things you've done. And so there is something important of that in that ritual that leads to a moral end that I think is positive.
Yeah. And I mean, apart from anything else, the rituals, specifically fasting rituals, it's like a self-tempering act of sacrifice. I mean, that's exactly what it is. There's no sort of clever analogy here. It's a sacrifice. And as a writer, I would always say that all emotion, all magic, certainly, is sacrifice. All art is sacrifice. There's no benefit that you get in this world without some cost as well. And I think that we all sort of sense that deep down, and it's quite nice to be able to control the sacrifices we make, because it makes us feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, well, there is something like, the best stories, like there. I don't know if you ever, if you like Dan Harmon at all, but like I like. I mean, he's basically just distilling Joseph Campbell into some kind of way of writing TV. But like there's I like the hero's journey as opposed to even if I'm writing like a sitcom, there is something that when the character gets what they want, but they have to give something up in order to get that makes that story actually meaningful.
Yeah.
And it's the same. I mean, it's taken from our real lives when, the sacrifice makes something more meaningful.
I think it's the basis of all story, isn't it? We don't allow our heroes to get something for nothing. It's just not narratively gratifying. In fact, to go right back to the whole kind of uniquely British only fools and horses thing, we actively dislike it when somebody gets something for nothing, and we lose all respect for that character because it ain't fair.
We're right at the end of the show. I just want to ask one last question. What were your parents' occupations when you were growing up?
My dad was an IT guy. He would say they're still around, actually. In fact, they're downstairs in my house right now watching my child. So that's a pertinent question. My dad was a network manager, he would say. So he linked computers in the earliest days of networking and was right there through the arrival of the internet. So we were always quite a kind of well-teched family at that time. We always had PCs, and we were like the first kid on my street with a modem and all that sort of stuff. He ended up working as a network manager for various very well-to-do schools, like the sort of feeder schools that their kids really do go to, Oxford and Cambridge. So we spent a little time living on the campus of a couple of these places, schools that I did not attend. I just lived there, which was always fun, driving through in my cheap car, playing heavy metal music and sneering at all these posh kids. My mum was a teacher. She specifically a reading teacher. She started out as a kindergarten teacher, and then later on specialized in Montessori techniques for teaching kids to read, and especially kids with dyslexia and dyspraxia. In fact, she used to work at a school where the princes Harry and William both attended for a little while. So she taught them both reading for a while. So yeah, I mean, there's no great mystery there. I mean, you've got the kind of the book loving literary strand, and you've got the I spend my whole fucking life on the internet strand. And there you go. That's me.
Sai, thank you. Thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate
My
it.
pleasure. Well, thank you for getting up so early.
I had to get up anyway, both because of my anxiety and because to walk the dog. So it was
Does the walking help? I say this as somebody who's this year coming to terms with my own issues in that regard.
yes, I think it does. I think it gets you out of your head. I think anything you can do to get out of your own head, it helps, at least for a fraction of a moment. And also,
Yeah,
honestly, anytime that I have like a script problem, I go take a walk, and the back of my brain somehow figures it out.
that's good. I
So.
find like there's this mythology about doing exercise, rush of endorphins, feel good. I think I must be broken because when I go for a run, I'm just miserable for the rest of the day. I'm just totally unproductive. I want to sit and stare at a dark wall. Um, but yeah, well, listen, this year has been brutal on all of us, but especially people who are feeling anxious about the world anyway. So you have my sympathy, man.
Well, thanks, and we'll see you all next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.